All right, Janine. Janine, where'd you grow up? Where are you from originally?
I was born in Jacksonville, Florida, and I lived there till I was about 14, 13, 14. And then I moved to South Florida, from Tampa and then South Florida for a couple of years, and
What
then
was
back to Florida.
what was your family like?
Well, when I was young, they had a lot of money and were kind of society people. And then my dad was in real estate, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. And then my brother just kind of went off the deep end with drugs and alcohol very young. And when he was 15 and didn't come home on a Saturday morning until after dawn, my dad, he had a blowout fight. I was 9 years old. My brother, he was 15. And so my dad gave my mom an ultimatum: either my brother left or he left, because no interventions were working. And my mom decided that he had to go. And my dad was an angry man. I mean, I've seen him throw my mom up against the refrigerator during fights, because he would drink a lot. They both did. And so in 1976, he left. And they had like a 3-year war. It was horrific. Um, I, while I was in school in the 7th grade, my mom called my sister and I out of school. We were in a private school because it turned out, well, she said that my father had hired a hitman to kill her and that he was going to abduct us. And so we went to a Days Inn and spent a week there, scared to death. Not, couldn't look above the windows for fear that we were going to get shot. And at the end of all of that, years later, when I got to know my father, because we were estranged from him for many years, when I was in college, he would take me to dinner at the Brown Derby at the university, when I went to school at the University of Florida in Gainesville. And it took a lot of me asking and drilling questions, but finally I believed him. It turns out my mom had gone to a bar and met a man and wanted to hire him to kill my dad. And a police officer who was undercover overheard the conversation. And so my dad was in his beach condo in Jacksonville, and a detective called him and said, "Somebody's coming to your door. Don't answer it unless we give you a phone call telling you it's one of our people." And before he knew it, he had 3 detectives in his apartment or his condominium. And they watched this man come up to the door, pause, I guess think about it, turn around and walk away. He did that twice. And I guess his gut told him not to knock on that door. So I guess they never caught the guy, but obviously my mother had lied to us and traumatized us to cover herself. So we ended up in the ghetto, and we lived in South Beach for a couple of years when it was still very much a ghetto between 81 and 83. Where I lived was later turned into the police station in South Beach. But in the time I was there, despite spending time hanging out on the street with my sister and another friend, and my sister getting caught up in drugs and being a victim of pedophilia, which today we can reflect on it and say that's what was going on. She dropped out of school in the 8th grade, barely passed the 8th grade, and because of drugs. And I fortunately had a gift. And so I was motivated and driven, and I got myself into gifted programs in Miami. When I was 14, I went to the Center for Expressive Arts. And then at 15, I was a junior in high school because I started school a year early. And I went to the Performing and Visual Arts Center, which was very competitive and very difficult to get into. And if I had stayed there for 2 years and finished school in Miami, I would have probably had a portfolio that could have gotten me into a private art school or something like that. But they built the police station there and we had to move. So we moved into my father's girlfriend's house before we moved back to Jacksonville. And it turned out that her name was Jeanine too. And my mom tells me, guess what? Her name's Jeanine too. Well, years later, I found out my mom was pregnant with me when my dad started seeing her. They had split up for about 1.5 years. And she decided to name me after my dad's girlfriend. So I didn't learn that for many years after even learning she existed. But her giving us her home to live in was the beginning of me opening up to getting to know my father a little better. And after open heart surgery, he became less of an angry man. He drank less. And I got to know a good human being later on in life. Meanwhile, we lived in her house for about a month, and then we moved back to Jacksonville. And we lived in the house we lived in before we left Jacksonville. And that's where my brother started to get really crazy. He would drink at least 1 gallon of vodka a day, plus whatever else he could get his hands on. And he was scary and violent and gay, which I had no problem with, but he was flaming gay. And I can remember coming home from the library, because I would go to the library to escape my family, and walking into the house, and he's naked in the living room with his boyfriend on the couch, or whoever he's with at the time. And that kind of thing was normal. I mean, and our house was filthy with cockroaches everywhere in the kitchen because he would never clean. I was the only one who would clean anything. We had double bolt locks on all of our bedroom doors to protect us from my brother's rants and raves when he would break our stuff and steal our stuff. There were a few weeks where my mom didn't buy food at all, longer than that. And all we had to eat was rice or grits with no salt or pepper. I learned how to just use herbs and water to make something to eat. And then I won an art contest, and I got $200, and I started my first bank account. And so at that point, my dad would wire me a little money, and I could go buy food, canned food and eggs, and hide them under my bed so I had food. At that point, I graduated from high school when I was 17, and I went to junior college for a short time, and then I went to the University of Georgia for a short time. And then I went to the University of Florida, where I got my degree in fine art, and was known in my art community there, So that was a good time in my life because I had success as an artist, and people knew who I was and admired my talent, which I wasn't used to. And then after college, I kind of floundered around for a while before I met my ex-husband. And I guess he kind of saved me from floundering around. And so 6 months into our relationship, we went to California for a trip he had friends here. Would have helped us relocate to Los Angeles, but John said no, he didn't want to come to California. He loved Florida. And I accepted that and ended up marrying him anyway. Maybe the reason why I married him, though, was because a few days after we came back from California, on January 8th, 1992, a police officer, a mental health worker, and a social worker came to our house and knocked on the door, and they came and told me that my brother was in jail for murdering my mom. And my jaw dropped. I cracked a few jokes because that's how I deal with trauma. And I don't remember the rest of our conversation, but they asked if I was okay. And I said yes. And the reason I know this is because years later, after I left my ex-husband, I went back to Gainesville, and I ended up with the same mental health counselor who had come to my house that day, who I had reached out for counseling after I left my ex-husband. And she reminded me of what had happened that day. And so I told them everything was fine, and they left. And when they were going to their car, they heard a blood-curdling scream from me coming out of the house. And I had completely forgotten about that. So my sister was in Texas, and she was a drug addict and homeless and on and off. And, my mom helped both of them. She never helped me. I was the one who was capable. And so she couldn't help. So my ex-husband and some of his friends went with me to clean my mom's house in St. Petersburg, Florida, when she died. The way she died, my brother had a male partner, lover, I guess, who was living in the house, who was not mentally competent and had been in and out of mental institutions, from what I was told by a detective. He had tried to eat razor blades to commit suicide. He just was not stable and not very intelligent. And he was pinned with the murder. My brother got off on lack of evidence. But they're pretty sure my brother did it. And my brother was brilliant. I mean, he also gave many men AIDS on purpose and may have killed his lover before he died in 2000 from AIDS. His lover also had AIDS. That can never be proven, but he was very scary growing up. So he was definitely a psychopath. And psychopaths are often brilliant, which he was before the drugs and the alcohol. So supposedly he killed her for $3,000 of insurance money. I imagine there were psychological issues much deeper than that. And the way he killed her would probably verify that fact. He strangled her with an electric cord. He stabbed her 3 or 4 times in her neck. And then he put a 6-inch gash through her stomach. Later on, years later, I found out from my sister, who had gone to the detective years later and had drilled him about what had happened. She told me that she was alive for a couple of hours after that he let her slowly bleed out before she died. And she was not a good mom. I mean, I hated my mom. So I had to go through grieving for someone that I never liked, that I felt relief was gone from my life. But I was the one left to pick up the pieces, to go through all the personal effects, to handle a garage sale so I could get money to cremate her. She didn't want to be cremated, but that's all we could afford. And my sister came to the house while I was doing the garage sale to make sure I wasn't going to keep anything or steal anything. Meanwhile, she wanted a box of papers, and I had not gone through them. And so, under duress, I gave it to her. I had a lady at the house at the time helping me price antique glass, and she stole $80 from that lady's purse and burned holes in my comforter. I let her spend one night in my house, and I asked her not to smoke in the house. And she not only smoked, but burned the floor and the comforter and whatever she could do. So a few months later, I find out that she got hold of my social security number and my birth certificate, and she got an ID in my name and charged bank accounts and credit accounts and stole a rental car in my name. And a detective was looking for me, my father told me. So my father faxed pictures of me and my sister to the detective and verified that it was my sister impersonating herself as me. And she was found in a methadone clinic in the stolen car. I had not spoken to her for over 20 years after that. And when I did, I learned that she had spent many years homeless, and she's probably still homeless in Oklahoma today, more than likely suffering schizophrenia because she had paranoid thoughts and was hearing things. And I haven't heard from her in a few years because she keeps getting her phone lost or stolen, and I just haven't heard from her. So all I can do is pray for her and my mom and my brother and hope that they become better souls on the other side. And before my brother died of AIDS in 2000, I'd gone to see a guru woman in Gainesville, which is a very new age community. I was learning Kundalini yoga from some American Sikhs, and they turned me on to this woman who was a guru named Ma Jaya Sati Bhagavati. And she had known Ram Dass in the 60s. And she had an ashram in Florida called Kashi Ashram for the Indian City of the Dead. It's in Sebastian, Florida. And her mission was to help people who were dying of AIDS die closer to God. And so I went to her darshan in Gainesville in 1997, and many of her devotees have AIDS. And I stood up in her darshan and I said, My brother has AIDS. He murdered my mom, and I wish he would die already. And so she had me come up to her on her podium and sit in front of her, and she said, I'm going to look into your eyes. And you might get afraid, but don't worry, everything will be okay. So I looked into her eyes. She had big glasses, and her eyes looked like they got bigger and kind of fogged over. And she asked me, are you afraid? And I said, no. She touched my third eye, she hugged me, and she gave me a Rudraksha Indian prayer bead in her business card and told me to come see her. Well, 3 years later, when my brother was close to death and my stepmother had encouraged me to see him before he died, I had not spoken to him since this had happened. I did not go to the court proceedings. I did not want to see the pictures. But I did go see him before he died. And I took him to see Ma Jaya. And it took a day and a half to get him to the other side of Florida, which should have taken an hour and a half. Because AIDS is a horrific disease. And he was degenerating and he could barely move. Mucus coming out of his nose, it was all he could do to just stay awake. I took him to a state park bathroom, and a couple of hours waiting for him, I had someone go look in there, make sure he wasn't dead, and he had fallen asleep on the toilet. So that's part of why it took so long to get him there. So he wasn't able to meet Ma Jaya, but she had prayed on a set of Rudraksha beads for him, and she'd offered to give him refuge there. They have some of the state-of-the-art doctors for AIDS in Sebastian, Florida, which she has organized. And he refused. He couldn't believe that I had done this for him. And so I took him back to Clearwater, and a couple of days later he collapsed, and his heart never resuscitated at the hospital. So 3 days before he died in hospice, I went and saw him, and I forgave him. It was the beginning of forgiving, because it's a really hard thing to do. But that started me on a journey to healing. And it's been many years and a lot of work to forgive my mother, my brother, my sister, my dad, my ex-husband, myself. I think the hardest is learning to forgive yourself. But if anyone who's suffering trauma can do that, they will find their way to healing. You have to learn to love yourself no matter what pain you've been through. It's not your fault. Even if you made bad decisions, something led you to make bad decisions. Childhood trauma is lifelong. Today, I am disabled from post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'm bipolar. I'm hypomanic. I'm not psychotically bipolar, but PTSD is a really hard thing to live with. I work really hard with my diet and getting enough sleep and exercise to be as stable as I possibly can. And that, and learning to love myself and forgive myself, is helping tremendously. So I can say I'm not a victim of domestic violence, I'm a survivor.
Were there things your brother went through as a child that you think may have led him down that path?
I had a therapist for 4.5 years when I was married. I had a nervous breakdown after a year and a half after what happened when my brother died. And I was in an abusive relationship with my ex-husband. And we came to the conclusion that it's possible that there was an incestuous relationship between my mom and my brother. I don't know, but they were unusually close. And she liked him being dependent on him because she needed that. She needed that company, that person close to her.
Dependent on her.
Yes, and maybe that's why he murdered her, because he didn't know how else to express his frustration, and he was already, mentally unstable. And if you believe in demonic entities, if you believe that can happen to people who open themselves with lots of drugs and stuff, then maybe my brother was possessed. What makes people evil? What makes people demonic or do horrific things? I mean, they've got to be lost spiritually. So that's all I can think is something maybe too intimate happened between them when he was very young. And my father was very angry and aggressive, and my brother was more effeminate. My father beat up my brother when he was 12 years old. He was molested by his bus driver at his private school. And my father handled it by beating up my brother and blaming him for letting it happen. I remember that fight. I was like 6 years old. And he threw him up against an open dishwasher in the kitchen. And my dad was very scary when he was angry. He had a lot of intensity as a person. So that was obviously going to be traumatic for my brother. I don't know. Maybe it's a combination of all of those things. Yeah. Other than that, I just don't have an answer.
It's a lot of family baggage to go through.
Yeah. Yeah. Fortunately, I'm working a trade with a hypnotherapist. She's helping me some to go through past life stuff, and maybe that'll help me with current life trauma. I take whatever trauma, whatever therapy I get that can come my way.
Have you found it's helpful?
Yes, absolutely. Therapy is very helpful. I think it should be more accessible to more people, I have disability and I have a psychiatrist, but getting a therapist, they don't really provide that. You have to pay for that. And it shouldn't be that way. We'd have a much more stable world if we could get free and accessible mental health care to people. But then we also just need food and housing for people. That helps a lot too.
I know it's not saying much, but you seem much more mentally stable than your siblings.
Yes.
And I wonder if your work as an artist
yes.
helped.
My gift and I wanted to be a famous artist. Now I'm maybe glad I'm not famous, because it's a lot of responsibility to be famous. I hope one day I can be more successful at it. But I mastered photorealism at the age of 16. As a senior in high school, my high school teacher gave me a project I did a collage of photographs that I put together. And she told me to draw the lines so close together that you can't tell one line from the other in black ebony pencil. And 5.5 weeks later, I produced my first truly photorealistic drawing. So my talent was my saving grace. I probably would have been better off financially if I'd become a psychologist, or there could have been many other things that I could have done in life and been more successful, but the art's food for your soul. And I recommend anyone to take up creative endeavors for therapy.
Yeah, I think the world is saved from having too many crazy people by people's art.
Yes, and taking away art.
So many of us would be totally crazy if we didn't have it.
Many of us. The ones who are lucky enough to have the arts, that's why they're not crazy.
That's exactly right.
And we've got to get them reinstated in the schools. Physical education and the arts are crucial to a person's physical and spiritual and intellectual development. So, yeah, more therapy and more art. That's what our society needs.
Exactly. I agree completely.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm glad you're doing better now.
It's a struggle. It's life. And, when you are a person who suffered trauma, you tend to surround yourself with people who suffered trauma. People who haven't suffered trauma don't understand you're scary for people. So, you know, I tend to have people in my life that also have a lot of trauma. And sometimes I'm always the one trying to raise people up, you know, but I also have my issues with depression, and not the mania so much. I'm older, gone through menopause, that helped the hyperactivity. Really, I'm hyperactive, and, you know, I have a genius level talent. So that'll make you what psychiatrists will call bipolar, but I've never been a danger to myself or anyone else. I've never been violent. I've never gone on shopping sprees with money I don't have, or, you know, I've never done any of those kind of things that are typical of bipolar people. That's why I say I'm hypomanic. But I get enough sleep. It's important to get enough sleep if you're bipolar. Even if you can't sleep at 4 o'clock in the morning, stay in bed and let your mind rest. Make sure you do that for 8 hours every night, at least. Take naps. They help too with stress.
Do you think the bipolar tendencies you picked up are inherited, or?
They might be stress-induced, probably trauma-induced.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if my mom was bipolar, or maybe she had borderline personality disorder. You know, she says we come from French royalty. Well, what that means is we come from inbreeding. So with inbreeding comes mental instability. And some get it and some don't. Some get the genius, some get the crazy. You know, sometimes you get a little bit of both, probably most of the time. But I think having a spiritual base and a connection to your higher power, however you want to define that, is huge in finding grounding and hope. You have to have faith to have hope.
Yeah, hope's important.
And you got to have hope and faith in order to heal, you know, and you have to embrace love for yourself and for others. Even the people that hurt you the most, you have to extend love to them, because it's the only way you can change the lower frequencies that cause people to act so horribly in the first place. If you're at a higher level, if you're living in love, you raise the vibration of the people around you. It's not easy, but it can be done. And you can do it for yourself most of all.
Yeah, that's the lesson to learn from all that.
Yes.
Is you're doing it for yourself.
Yes.
And you help everyone else around you.
Yes, absolutely.
Everyone.
Everyone. You help everyone when you do it for yourself. And Mark, if you want more stories in the future, I've got a lot more stories.
I think maybe we just tipped the iceberg there.
Yeah, really. It is the tip of the iceberg, yes.
All right, Jeanine, thank you so much for sharing your story.
You're welcome. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Those are beautiful things you shared at the end, too.
Thank you. We want people to have hope. It isn't all despairing. Trauma can lead to healing and empowerment. So, anyone who's suffering trauma, just remember, if you can get to a place of loving yourself, forgiving yourself, and loving those and forgiving those who hurt you the most, you will experience a sense of empowerment from that exercise.
Absolutely.
It's a gift to yourself and to the other people who probably need it desperately. They're hurting, or else they wouldn't have hurt other people.
Beautiful talk. Thank you, Jeanine.
Thank you.